Good evening. Welcome to TDM Talk Show. I'm Karen Keith. In 2016, Google has announced its 10 key initiatives for the next billion users to make the internet universally accessible. This means developing countries will have equal access to online information. Let's find out how technology is used in developing countries. Our guest for tonight is an author of several books, including The Next Billion User, Digital Life Beyond the West with Harvard University Press. She has consulted for both the public and private sector and sits on several boards, including the Facebook Advisory Committee and the World Women Global Council in New York. She is also the founder and executive director of a digital campaign organization, Catalyst Lab, and an associate professor at Erasmus University Rotterdam in Amsterdam. Let's welcome Dr. Payal Arora. Good evening and welcome to TDM.
Good evening, and thank you for the kind introduction.
Oh, you're welcome. So first of all, this is your first time in Macau. So welcome to Macau.
Thank you. It's been quite a trip, yeah.
And you recently had a webinar about the next billion user. Could you tell us more about it? What was your purpose while you're here in Macau?
Look, it's the purpose of this was about innovation, because we know across the world people are obsessed about innovation. When you talk about innovation, countries feel like it's an existential crisis. Like if they're not innovating, they are going to go extinct.
Yes.
Societies, like parents, feel that if their children are not getting into the innovation game, then they're not going to make it, right? So it's really so fundamental, and today innovation is seen as or is used as a proxy as technology. New technology means that you are going to go ahead. And part of my talk, and really rooted in my book, is this case that we need to look closely at what are we calling innovation, because technology per se is not sufficient to call as innovation. Right. Because we are always coming up with a way in which we can improvise, right? Especially with the next billion users. They are improvising from below. They are hacking their way. If you, like, piracy is technically innovation, because if you don't get, say, you don't have the money for Netflix, what do? You hack your way, you innovate a different way in which you can access entertainment. Right. But that is, conceptualized as something criminal and deviant, right? But if you're an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley, you're innovating.
Right.
So this idea that innovation is not exceptional, but it's on an everyday level, it is not necessarily good or bad, but it's basically coming up with alternative solutions to chronic problems. And we need to move away from this virtuousness of innovation, because there are some good innovations, but we can't blanket it as everything is wonderful, right? Yes. And so that was really the fundamentals about this conversation of opening it up and saying, what does innovation really mean for the next billion users, the marginalized majority, the global poor, who are fast getting online and are very passionate about these new technologies.
And Doctor, we've been hearing it everywhere, the next billion users, but for our audience who are not familiar with it, what is it exactly?
Yes, of course, it's such a buzz term. Like you mentioned, Google set up a lab as of last year. In fact, the Wall Street loves the term now, NBU markets, because it's very much like the past in the 90s. They came up with emerging markets because people didn't want to invest in developing countries. It sounded very high risk. But if you said emerging markets, people are like, yes, that sounds good. I want to invest in that.
This sounds appealing.
Right? Exactly. So now you have NBU markets. There's a sort of a promise that the West is saturated and we need to look elsewhere. But so that's not how the stand I take in my book. The next billion users are basically indeed a population that many countries, all the technology companies are very wary of and very excited about, because they're like, okay, we know there's this rising adoption of mobile internet, right? They are fast coming online. There's this entire demographic, and we don't know much about them. We barely know anything about them because we never paid attention to them. We never thought they would come online so quickly, use data so much, and in such a diverse purposes. And if we want to innovate and come up with future technologies, we need to know who these people are. And who they are is part of what my book's about.
Right. So technology has been adopted so fast and has had a profound impact in our lives. From few thousands, now more than 4 billion internet users. So more and more people from emerging economies or developing countries get online and they're using the internet. And based from your findings, so you've gone to different places, you've gone to India, you've gone to China, the Middle East. What were your initial findings?
Yeah,
and I believe this has been done long years ago.
Yeah, so, well, I've been very attracted to seeing what are these different users, what do they do when they get online? Because here's this conceptualizing of that if you are a low-income person, right, which is what the next billion users are. Who are they? They're predominantly young. They are from low-income communities, and they are getting on the mobile. And you think that if they're in extraordinarily different contexts, they're coming from such different scenarios than us, then surely their practices when they go online, their online behaviors must be very different. What they want from the mobile internet must be significantly different from you and I, right?
Right.
But what I found astonishing is regardless of whether you're a teenage girl in Riyadh or you're a girl in Boston or a boy from India, it doesn't even matter across classes. What you're seeking for so badly is to make yourself visible and heard, to self-actualize, to discover who you are. And often, a lot of these consumers are living in extremely conservative societies, where societies are telling them, their parents, their schools, the culture, right, the cultural norms of what a girl should do, what a boy should do. And so you have all this around you. And then you have this small space called the mobile internet, like a WhatsApp, a WeChat, or this little tiny space where you can actually share a joke, check out something, make a comment, and slowly you get to see what interests you, what are your tastes, who are your friends, and you start to discover who you are. And what I'm saying is the most extraordinary thing about who these different populations are is that they're all rather ordinary and like you and I. And that to me is what is the most interesting. They're driven by the same things like entertainment, the need for romance, gaming, and this is what motivates them to not just take on new technologies, but also to stay on certain sites for very long, right?
And you mentioned in one of your talks, you mentioned about like the leisure. And that's one of the reasons why they're using the internet. And porn was an example, and it's been widely. A lot of a lot of people are watching porn from say India and the Philippines mostly. How do you differentiate the online activity from, for example, from Brazil to India, say?
Yeah,
because it's a entirely different culture.
Definitely. Okay, firstly, just about porn, it's like there's such a moral panic about porn. It's like, people are so nervous. I was just talking on a show in India on We the People, and people are like, oh my God, TikTok is very popular, right? In India, super popular. But they're like, oh, these children are going to watch porn and they're going to get corrupted, and what's going to happen to our children? Yes, that is some part of it, but a majority of what they're doing is just like, really harmless. And the thing is that, yes, of course, majority of people, actually pornography sites are the #1 sites around the world.
The number one.
Yeah, regardless of whether you're from Brazil or India, you are consuming porn. But look at the fact is many societies don't talk about sex. Sex doesn't exist. Or when you talk about sex,
sexual education per se.
Sexual education in schools, it's a dirty subject. It's something that you're telling your daughter, you better be very, very concerned about it, but you're not telling her what it is. How it's, on the other hand, it's very normal, right?
Or if you get married, acceptable.
Right? Yeah, so there's all this, and then so this absolute silence makes who the educator? Pornography sites. Pornhub becomes the educator of society because we are unwilling to provide different environments for our children to normalize and talk about sex in a normal, healthy way. But in terms of differences between Brazilian young people and, say, Indians, one thing I noticed was young people in Brazil are far more savvy about their privacy. They're far more distrustful of digital media. Because of the history of maybe surveillance,
right.
they live in communities where they're constantly being watched, whether from the police, and we're talking about low-income communities. So often they're very surveilled by police, and it's also to do with the history in relationship with the police making. So a lot of my participants were, one, very ruthless about when somebody's privacy is hacked or their video or between their girlfriend or boyfriend is like out in the public. They had little sympathy. They're like, what are you doing making that video? You have no business. You should know by now. You should stop being so stupid. The internet is a public space, and I don't trust putting my information because there's a lot of like fake this, or these accounts get hacked and
or scams.
So there's so much like anger. On the other hand, they would still say they were so addicted to it. They say, oh, we sleep with our phone next to us. We are constantly checking 24/7. So they felt like they are compelled to do it, but they didn't trust it. Whereas Indian young people in these low-income communities were far more euphoric. And I think it's also kind of cultural in the sense that they were less sort of concerned about privacy versus their Brazilian counterpart. And the way you just have to look at how Indians use Facebook.
Oh yeah.
They say everything on it.
And they basically just add people, strangers online.
Definitely. Yeah, many, many strangers. So, and that's a very typical practice. In the West, less than 4% of your friends are strangers. That is a study done, like in a typical person living in Germany or, in New York or etc.
Right.
Whereas if you're from, say, India, it would be half or 2/3, because they don't use Facebook as a social networking site in a sort of a social way. They use it as LinkedIn and as well as Tinder, all wrapped in one. Because they also, like they're dating online, they like romancing and private messaging. So they sort of all in one. Which is very kind of interesting because Jio is seeing it as a market opportunity, realizing these customers want a sort of ecosystem where everything comes to them, right? And so they're building themselves as a platform where you can offer it. Because, so these are the nuanced differences, I would say.
It's funny because I met one Indian man. It was long
online.
Before. No, not online. It was long before. I did interview him, and he said, I asked him about the internet, and he said, you mean Facebook? So for most of them, Facebook is the internet, is that correct?
Absolutely. So, I mean, in some sense, it is actually the truth. It's not because they're only staying with Facebook, but this comes from a legacy of, Facebook's altruistic mission of offering limited access to select sites and calling it the internet.org, which, by the way, Facebook got into a lot of trouble because they claimed to be the internet when actually they were only giving access to a few sites and going against net neutrality principles. So it was shut down in India and also, I believe, Egypt, but a number of countries still hold it, like Myanmar. They didn't have internet a couple of years ago, like less than 2% of the population. And then when it became more open, then it went to almost double, and then it became almost half the population, but it was really access to Facebook, right? So quickly, people, whether you're a businessman, a politician, you built your services on that platform because that was what was mainly available. And so in some sense, yes, Facebook was the internet, but things are changing a lot, right? You look at, like, just last year, data plans have become so extraordinarily cheap in these countries, like 20 cents per GB in, say, India versus...
Sometimes, way before, they stay in internet cafes all day.
Yeah, and now I don't think that's a thing, I mean,
now.
it's maybe you use it for very strategic purposes, like downloading massive files, like movie files, or like entire Game of Thrones series, or something like that.
That's right.
But not because that's the place where you want to be, engaged on a day-to-day level.
And when you were doing your research, how long was the research process? And based from your findings, what internet access really means to them?
So basically, my research happened at multiple stages across these years. It's been built over a decade. So I went did almost like more than a year of research in the Himalayas in India in a place called Almora, and I stayed there for more than a year, and I was really trying to see what do people really do when broadband had just come. This was in 2008, right?
Broadband.
Yeah, broadband had just come to that area, and also they were just, cyber cafes were super popular. And even then, by the way, I remember interviewing all these cyber cafe owners, and they said, without Orkut, which was the Facebook of the day then, and now nobody even knows about it. Exactly. They literally said, without Orkut, our business would be dead. That was then that leisure, I realized leisure is really the key reason why these guys are getting online. People were, media is telling the kids, no, get an education, study from it and all. And they're like, yeah, sure, we're going to go to the cyber cafe to study. And then they're like gaming, and then they're chatting with people on Orkut. I mean, they're kids, right? What do you expect? So, I mean, it's like Bertrand Russell would say, if you give a choice for a child to climb a tree or do math, they'll climb the tree. All the time.
I do the same.
Exactly. So why do we think they would be extraordinarily different, right? Just because they happen to be low income? I mean, it's not the case.
But do you think that first-time online users from developing countries tend to be vulnerable?
Yes, of course. On one hand, they are vulnerable. On the other hand, there is a very quick learning process. I noticed they're far more social. People do a lot of social learning. So you get...
Is it because of peer pressure, or maybe
No,
it's the
they're
trend?
excited. Remember that these are really cool technology. Unlike computers of the past, which is like, oh my God, the school is telling me to use computers, the government...
With a 3.25 floppy disk.
Exactly. That was not cool. But the mobile phone, you see all these kids flocking, they all want to just touch it. They want to, like, everyone wants to have a stake in the game. And of course, introduce the smartphones, which are getting cheaper by the day. Yeah.
Very cheap.
So, but kids are very drawn to phones, and and they like to tinker, and they all share, like, all the best ways of getting. Of course, they're constantly learning, but they're constantly learning in ways in which they can access this movie or this clip, or how do I get, like, I want to really see this or this game. Is there like a non legit version out there? Blah blah blah. And that's how they look at it. But the thing is, what we underestimate, people, we could just say, oh, this is terrible. Look at them squandering this opportunity. But those learning skills are easily transferable because they're learning these new technologies. They're learning very fast because they're highly motivated. They tend to do it in groups, unlike, unfortunately, in many Western countries, teenagers are very isolated. It's also, you better know it, right? So they're not as much sharing as
they love the
used to be.
interaction.
Yeah, there's less. In fact, there's a growing sense of loneliness. And actually, it is backed by the fact that by more than 60-something% of young people say they're very alone. They would have only one person maybe they could count as a friend. So if you start to read what's going on right now, it is a very different scenario from that in emerging markets, which are far more communal in terms of they are always surrounded by these people. They may have grown up with them because they're in the same village or in this, like, favela, a small little township. So there's a very different notion of sharing, learning together, and giving the best tips to get the best prices and information circulates faster than we know it,
Let's talk about the dangers of having equal access to the internet.
So, firstly, there will never be equal access. Like, we will always be in an unequal terrain because there'll always be someone with a 5G network once you get 4G, right? And so, I don't know, it's not about who has everything, right? Because that's never going to happen. But rather, who has the essentials to be able to navigate themselves through their social life, which is mandatory, in the given society, right? As things become cashless, as identities become digitized. So are we giving people the choice to engage in these, diverse institutions? And the risks, of course, are privacy, data, hacking. I mean, it's like a honeypot for hackers, right?
Yes.
So on one hand, you hyper-centralize data in certain spaces. And of course, then when you over-centralize, then the likelihood of, massive, data hacking can have huge repercussions on millions of citizens. So we need to be very, very careful of who is collecting our data, because there's a lot of mixing of who, whether it's like where the companies are coming from. Do the governments have control over these companies? Otherwise, it'll become like the colonial days again, right? They're coming from the West.
You don't know.
Exactly.
They just attack us.
Data.
Like, whoa.
So, well, I mean, we don't even know where the hackers are coming from. So really, governments, in the push to innovate, are doing so much in terms of pioneering these new technologies, but are not putting sufficient attention into storage, into data regulators, and people who can maintain these systems in ways that are constantly checking, like, are these getting violated? Also anonymizing data so people's privacy is protected. So there's so much to do with it, but we're just not budgeting enough resources for that, right?
Right.
So.
And what are some ways of improving the quality and lowering the risk? Because we're talking about the risk.
So the ways in which you can reduce risks are, as I said, from a government level, of course, you take responsibilities and invest not just in, every time you invest in an innovation, make sure you're investing a good part also in maintaining that innovation, because the innovation is not static, particularly in the tech world, right? There's no such thing as an internet product. It is a constantly evolving space based on the users. As users keep using that technology, it's changing, and new problems are evolving. As well as then, so there's multiple layers. Technology companies, they need to pay more to human moderators. It's not all getting automated. In fact, I'm sure in Macau they have like slang. I'm sure young people have so much slang that if they start talking to us, we won't know what they're saying, right?
That's right.
So you can't actually moderate that conversation necessarily by automation, because by the time you come up with an algorithm that's able to detect it, the culture, the way in which people talk may change. Young people change so quickly. So they need to invest. Like Facebook is rather stingy in that. They only have something like 10,000 moderators for like billions of their consumers. That's nothing.
So they cannot monitor.
They need to, not monitoring as much as to be able to make sure that these spaces are healthy and safe, especially for women. A lot of these spaces are becoming far more unhealthy for women, misogyny, toxic, toxic comments against women, deep dive videos of them naked, especially in conservative societies, can ruin a girl's reputation. Even, a lot of these fake videos. And of course, fake news, right?
God.
There's so-called, I hate that term because, but the fact is that how do you know what is real and what is not? Exactly.
That's who.
And to have companies really account for it by working not with other technologists, but with media activists, with real journalists. Pay journalists more. We are killing the journalism field by saying everything's getting digitized. No, we need them. We need investigative journalism even more so than ever before. Technology companies are just not willing to part with their money. But until and unless we put that pressure, and the public is the best way, because they are the next billion users, and if they don't feel safe, they will move on, right? And so I think for everyone's best interest.
And you mentioned about the investigative journalists, but the problem is the bloggers. There's now you cannot. It's so hard to identify. For example, in a press conference, there's the press and there's bloggers, or there's tech bloggers, for example. Like, do you see that there's a lot of challenges and opportunities for both sides? Like, it's kind of hard, for example, like for my career.
Yeah. Look, firstly, this line between bloggers and journalists is a false line. You see some savvy journalists becoming bloggers.
Yes.
And in some sense, well, it's not necessary, because say supposing you're in a very conservative journalistic institution, right? Who is always telling you, you can't publish this, you can't write this, you need another story on Donald Trump, like we haven't read enough about him, and you want to do something just fresh and different. There's something independent about being a blogger, but you couldn't make money before. Now you can monetize it. But I'm not saying it's that easy. But you see that happening also among influencers, right?
That's right.
people, so the
Influencers.
barrier, yeah.
Oh, that term, influencers.
Right, like the influence of these guys coming in and breaking the grounds, and they don't have any sort of media training, PR experience, right? And they're entering it in a way, but they can also be very powerful in a good way. So I'm saying there's a whole spectrum of they can be negatively influencing to positively influencing. But the question we should really ask is, why are people drawn to these people? Why aren't they respecting mainstream, right? Because that's what's the heart of this, right? Is the concern is because mainstream continues to not be able to innovate enough, not be able to let go of, say, the same scripts. They've become so risk averse. So yes, they feel they have to cover Trump, right? They feel they have to do that, right? So you have the same, we need to cover stories also in this particular angle.
Right.
And when we keep thinking in those ways, you will not innovate and people will distrust you because you're not showcasing all what's actually happening in the world, actually happening in these communities. And that's why there is more legitimacy for fresh voices. And it's also the way in which they're speaking to the audience. Right. There's less condescension. It's more like, if you look at the best blogs and influencers, they're not talking top down. They're sharing in a way which is involving you intrinsically into their lives and saying, this is my perspective. And it's more layman's terms. Exactly. It's the language they use, but also the way they frame it, the kind of stories they cover. It's a whole host of factors which add to their authenticity. And that actually is something that we should learn a little more, especially from mainstream, that needs to get back the credibility. Because we need legitimate, strong sources, and that goes back to paid journalists more. It's an old-fashioned, old-fashioned solution.
Hands down.
Yeah, just get that wallet, open.
Just make it rain. So, for the next question, do you remain optimistic on the impact of digital technology, or there are some cautions that need to be raised?
Look, I tend to be the optimistic one because, at least I'm talking about in Western countries, there's so much growing pessimism, like the world is coming to an end. You hear these things. Facebook is killing democracy, right? These very existential, one technology for all, like the Lord of the Rings, right? Yes. It's going to devastate entire populations. And I like to sort of counterbalance it, because what happens is it's a matter of perspective. Of course, it's both. But when you are so focused on just the negative aspects and all the risks, you're creating constant panic amongst parents, amongst educators, among governments, that they're like, oh my God, we should censor, we should ban, So you start to shut doors. When actually we should look at why are people, in spite of these high risks, getting online, attracted to a certain sites? What are they doing? Why are they doing it? Can we help them in a way which can make their lives more fulfilled, right? And yes, sometimes we need to discourage them also from being there, online all the time. But let's start, first asking, what is it that they're genuinely getting? Because surely that has a lot of value. This is why they're being pulled into it. Let's not condescend and say, oh my God, they're brainless people who are just getting sucked into this whirlpool and they have no idea, right? And with that, we will just continue to get in a very wrong direction, and very different people will lead the way.
And for the next question, are you working on a new project or a new book, and can you share a little bit about it?
Yeah, so my next book is really about critiquing this whole AI for good, because the next wave is about AI. AI is supposed to change the world and everything. People don't even know what is artificial intelligence. There's this idea that it can, statistics that by 2020, these jobs are gone. By 2040, no more jobs. Are you kidding me? You can't even get Wi-Fi on the plane. I can't even get my boarding pass properly on the thing. I mean, we assume that voice recognition is just going to be pervasive. The way we talk, the way our languages, these technologies are extraordinarily limited in its capacity. And so the book is really about assessing what does AI for good mean. And also I like the idea that it has a zeal, it has a missionary zeal to do good for society. I'm sorry, but it's like saying electricity for good. Can we say that? Does that sound right to you? No. Electricity for good sounds as stupid as, to me, AI for good.
Right.
And that is the thing, is that we need to sort of disassociate, and that's where my book is going to be going, is to really look closely of what do people mean by AI, when is it really meaningful, how is it really going to change, and when, for the most part, it's not.
And when are you planning to publish it?
Well, hopefully
Say
in a year or so, I'm hoping. Yeah, so let's see. Like next year, get it written, and then year after. So let's see. Well, I just finished one book, so normally, it's like giving birth.
Right.
People are like, when are you going to have the next child? Exactly.
Okay.
So when's the next baby? I'm like, yeah, normally I'm like, no more babies. And they're like, maybe.
Well,
that needs a companion, right?
Good luck. Good luck. All the best.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us here.
Thank you for having me here.
Join us again next week for another episode of TDM Talk Show. I'm Karen Keith. Good evening.